A loopy state visit by the French president, President Trump's dubious administrative picks, and a sinking press freedom score are raising questions about U.S. leadership at home and abroad. We'll look at them on this edition of It's Only Thursday, the Washington Post Opinions Roundtable. I'm opinion writer Molly Roberts, and joining me are global affairs columnist Max Boot, media critic Eric Wemple, and political commentator Dana Milbank. We're going to dive into the drama around EPA Chief Scott Pruitt, the Macron visit, and more. But first, we need to talk about President Trump's call into one of his favorite shows, Fox and Friends, this morning. He swung from the First Lady's birthday, happy birthday Melania, to the Russia investigation, to North Korea, Kanye West, and, you guessed it, the fake news media. Enough material to fill a Trump bingo card and walk away a winner. When asked why his lawyer Michael Cohen intends to plead the Fifth Amendment in a civil case involving his payment of hush money to porn star Stormy Daniels, Trump shrugged it off.
Mr. President, how much of your legal work was handled by Michael Cohen?
Well, as a percentage of my overall legal work, a tiny, tiny little fraction. But Michael would represent me and represent me on some things. He represents me, like with this crazy Stormy Daniels deal. He represented me, and from what I see, he did absolutely nothing wrong. There were no campaign funds going into this.
Then why is he pleading the
Fifth? Would have been a problem. Because he's got other things. He's got businesses. And from what I understand, they're looking at his businesses. And I hope he's in great shape. Yeah. But he's got businesses, and his lawyers probably told him to do that. But I'm not involved, and I'm not involved. And I've been told I'm not involved.
So, Dana, Stormy Daniels' attorney says that this was a hugely damning admission by Trump, that Cohen is representing him in this case. Is that true? How damning is this really?
Well, there's a legal term for what the president did, and that is stepping in it. It really was extraordinary. I was saying it's not so much like an interview. It was like a 30-minute long tweet. When he was in all caps for large parts of it. He was using a lot of exclamation points. Sure. First of all, he undermined the Stormy Daniels case by saying, in contrary to what he and Michael Cohen had said before, that he was representing me. So Michael Cohen wasn't acting on his own. Right. And then he says it's a tiny proportion of his overall legal work is being handled by Cohen. Okay, well, great. Then why are they demanding attorney-client privilege for all of these documents? So it's just like every time the president opens his mouth, you don't know what's going to come out, and that was not helpful.
I'm sure his lawyers would love to get a court injunction to get him to shut
up. They would like him to take the Fifth.
Yeah.
And for a president or a businessman who racked up more than 4,000 pieces of civil litigation, a tiny, tiny fraction to him may be a
that would be a very large fraction.
Right,
for
exactly.
The rest of us. Yeah.
So, Eric, Fox and Friends is usually kind of a safe space for President Trump. It's one of the friendliest places he can go.
Absolutely
they weren't so easy on him this time, were they?
I think if you watch the entire 28 or 29 minutes, you'll realize that there were certain outbursts of journalism, though, as we saw right there. I think what Fox and Friends is what's happening with the president. You saw last December, Michael Schmidt got an impromptu interview. He's with the New York Times. Got an impromptu interview with Trump down in Florida on vacation, when Trump was on vacation. And he was hammered for not asking tough enough questions of Trump. He did basically the Maggie Haberman approach, which is try to keep him talking. Just prod him here and there, and just keep him rolling. Just what Dana said, a long tweet.
It's like a hostage situation.
Right, and
you
so
just
it's
keep him
the
talking.
strange world where Fox and Friends, which is a propaganda channel, and the New York Times is sort of converging on a strategy for interviewing Donald Trump, which is just keep him going.
Although from what I saw, I didn't see the whole thing, but from what I saw, it actually seemed like even the Fox hosts were trying to move him along but he wanted to continue with this crazy tirade about the media. I think they were actually trying to help him out by getting him to move along.
And they said, obviously you have a million things to do, we better get going.
We better stop you from doing more damage to yourself.
And the Southern District of New York has gone ahead now and told the court, hey, we have information that the whole nation has seen on Fox and Friends that President Trump admitted this.
Trump is way too busy to talk to Robert Mueller. He has way too many things to do to submit to an interview under oath.
And if Mueller is watching all of this and he does get the president in for the interview, we know what to do. It's not what John Karl did 2 days ago and sort of get in his face and demand to know if he's going to pardon Michael Cohen. You ought to tee it up as a softball, and then the president manages to hang himself.
That is the prevailing method, I believe. That is. Another norm broken.
Yeah, I mean, but they are. I mean, Mueller would have certain advantages, like the penalty of perjury, and being able to spend more than half an hour. I mean, they could spend days and hemming him in. And I mean, I've talked to people who have been involved in previous court cases with Trump, and basically, as we all know, he just spews endless BS. But gradually, you can press down, keep pressing, and force him into a situation where he either has to commit perjury or actually tell the truth. And you can get there. It's just going to take a lot of patience.
Well, that's where the Fifth Amendment thing gets kind of interesting, because Trump has a history of talking about the Fifth Amendment, right? I don't know if any of you guys have been looped into it, but I've seen a lot of people talking about Trump flip-flopping on whether the Fifth Amendment, you would only ever plead that if you're guilty, and then going ahead and pleading it himself in a ton of cases.
I believe his legal analysis is that you're guilty if you take the Fifth Amendment, if you happen to be his political opponent. However, if you happen to work for him, that's a sign of you exercising your God-given civil liberties.
That's right.
I think that's right.
Right, exactly. And another thing that I think is interesting about him stepping in it here, and you were talking about other court cases, we saw the travel ban case in front of the Supreme Court yesterday, and that's a place where Trump has kind of stepped in it on Twitter and elsewhere, being too forthright about what he actually believes.
Yeah.
Contradicting Sean Spicer and other folks.
Yeah, I was at the court for the hearing yesterday, and the side bringing the suit, they were quite plain about it and saying, if it were just the text of the order, we wouldn't be here. That's not the problem. The problem is what they call the animus, and that comes out in the tweets, it comes out in the things he said. So if it hadn't been for all the add-on things that he said, and the government knew it was a problem, the Solicitor General said, well, these are things he said before the campaign, but wait a second, what about retweeting the anti-Muslim videos? Right. He is the legal doctrine of stepping in it. I think there's one in Latin too. I'm going to try to get that for you.
But I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, Dana, but the impression I got from the reporting of the oral arguments is that the conservative justices basically want to put their hands over their ears and pretend they haven't heard a thing that Trump has actually been saying.
I think that's probably right. I mean, certainly 4 of them do, and Kennedy was, as is often the case, sort of on both sides there. And he did say, so wait a second, if some guy says all these hateful things, he's running for mayor, and then he's elected, and 2 days later he acts on all these hateful things, we're supposed to ignore everything he said? And Noel Francisco, the Solicitor General, basically said yes.
So, some good news for Trump, maybe, if it looks like the court is going to go on his side, but there is plenty of other bad news. We also learned this morning that Ronnie L. Jackson, President Trump's physician of Incredible Genes fame, and nominee, until this morning, to head the Veterans Affairs Administration, has withdrawn his name from consideration. Jackson had faced growing allegations of professional misconduct. This comes as Environmental Protection Agency Chief Scott Pruitt, also under attack, appears before a critical Congress. He's facing lawmakers' questions about reports of wasteful spending and other ethics violations. So, Dana, can you give us a quick rundown of the controversy swirling around Jackson? What exactly is he accused of?
No, I can't give a quick rundown. It would take the entire rest of the show and many other Thursdays to
What about
go
just the
along.
hotel room?
I'm actually, I don't hesitate to criticize the president and his various nominees and appointees. There's something that makes me uncomfortable about the process with Ronnie Jackson. Now, it seems like it's perfectly fair game what's going on with Scott Pruitt. These are well-documented things out there in the public domain. Inspector General and others have looked at this. Now, the fair case against Ronnie Jackson is he has absolutely no business running the Veterans Administration because he's a doctor who basically said nice things that the president could live to be 200. That was his qualification. I'm a little uneasy about John Tester coming out and saying, well, 23 anonymous people said all these things about maybe, he was drinking too much and crashed a government vehicle, prescribing painkillers and other things. I would feel better if the people were out there on the record saying these things. It may well be true, but it's in the category of innuendo. So that is a little disconcerting, but he gave other reasons to be disqualified.
Trump set him up. That's the problem with putting somebody forward without any kind of vetting, because this is the kind of stuff that should happen during the vetting process where you can investigate these allegations and get to the bottom of it. And it really is unfair to the admiral to have him be thrust out there without any of this kind of background work, and all of a sudden all these, as you say, allegations, you don't know if they're true or not, all of a sudden in the public domain where they should have been explored beforehand.
Right. You do your own Oppo research on your guy first,
Yeah.
and then at least you're ready to say something about it. They had nothing to say other than, I guess I wouldn't go through with this process if I were him.
So Sarah Huckabee Sanders, the White House spokeswoman, is also skeptical of the allegations. She suggested that the criticism is baloney.
Dr. Jackson's record as a White House physician has been impeccable. In fact, because Dr. Jackson has worked within arm's reach of 3 presidents, he has received more vetting than most nominees. Given his unique position of trust and responsibility, Dr. Jackson's background and character were evaluated during 3 different administrations. Dr. Jackson has had at least 4 independent background investigations conducted during his time at the White House, including an FBI investigation conducted as part of the standard nomination vetting process.
So Sanders says that Jackson was heavily vetted, and so was EPA Chief Scott Pruitt, but we have allegations about him that predate the administration. So these are just 2 examples, really, kind of on the highest level of Trump and his administration failing to vet people for these jobs. And I think that kind of has a lot to do with why the government is as empty as it is, although I think the Trump administration might blame it on Schumer for seeing cloture on everyone.
Helene Olin earlier this week wrote a piece that I thought was pretty good. She said, don't focus on the vetting, focus on what actuated Trump to tap this guy in the first place. And I believe, if I'm not mistaken, this morning on Fox and Friends, Trump gave a little freewheeling, free associating insight onto that. He said at one point, I believe, it was a long interview, but I think he said at one point, I just asked him, hey, how about the VA? You know, I think he said that. We'll have to fact check me on that. But, he gave insight into just like how little thought he gives to any of this stuff. Because, he, obviously Jackson did his job of essentially saying how great Trump is and his genes and his health. He sounded like his own, his former doctor up in New York.
The next nominee.
Yeah. So, it's not so much the vetting, it's the instinct to begin with, or lack thereof.
And it's also, I think, just indicative of the larger kind of chaos and incompetence of the Trump administration. After 15 months in office, you would expect that they would be getting better at this, but they really are not. And in fact, as we've seen over the last few months, Trump is tired of anybody trying to contain him. He's tired of the grown-ups in the White House trying to tell him what to do and impose some order and discipline. He wants to be, this is like Bruce Banner breaking out as the Hulk here, and there's nobody who can stop the guy. And that's essentially where we are.
I think that's true. I was over at the White House earlier this week talking to some of the reporters and getting a sense of their bleak existences. But there is a notion that this isn't necessarily something that Trump doesn't want to have happen. He enjoys stirring the pot. He enjoys dominating every story and news cycle, even if it's, we can sit here and say it's clearly not good for him and his administration and his agenda, but if he considers he's been atop of that news cycle every day, every hour, every minute, he's winning. So, we could say objectively, well, maybe Shulkin, you could have kept him and avoided this headache, but he would see this as, wow, it's something else to, throw everybody off balance with. And if that's your standard, he is winning.
Yeah, no, I think that's exactly right. I think that gets at the core of the Trump presidency because, we can certainly sit here and say that if this guy were about trying to get policy victories or get his poll numbers up, kind of the conventional metrics of presidential success, he's doing a horrific job of it.
Right.
But if his actual metric of success is, am I feeding my egomania? Am I at the center of world attention? Am I at the top of every news cycle, as you say? Then, as you say, he is succeeding. And I think that actually is his standard because it's not like he actually wants to achieve anything as president. He just wants to be in the center of the spotlight. He wants to have the entire world riveted on him. And the crazier he acts, the more we're riveted on him.
Winning.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, I think along those same lines, everyone said Trump went on Fox and Friends this morning and looked unhinged and looked ridiculous. But it's kind of another example of him being the ringmaster of this media circus because we spent all our time looking at him on Fox and Friends, and maybe we're even ignoring what's going on with Pruitt in Congress right now. We have a comment.
And nobody would care if you were like a normal president who's kind of giving boring scripted talks every day. That wouldn't be generating this kind of attention, right?
We have a comment on YouTube from Richard Darlington who says, maybe we should talk about the impact of Trump's interview on Fox being seen the world over. So, as a world guy, Max, what do you think? Is this damaging?
I mean, no more damaging than everything that he's said and done ever since taking office and long before. I mean, he's making the United States into a laughingstock. I mean, it's kind of ironic because Trump often says, they're laughing at us, they were laughing at us. But no, in fact, they're laughing at him, not at us. But because he is our president, I think he's dragging the entire country down with him. And it further contributes to this image of a guy who is unhinged and is literally capable of saying or doing anything. Now, you can make the case, and I'm sure his partisans will, that reputation has some benefits, and it may in fact have some benefits if it puts some fear of Trump into our enemies. But I think there's a much larger downside to it, which is that it's also putting this fear into our allies, and they don't feel like they can trust us anymore because we are so erratic. And I think, Macron was here trying to talk some sense into him, and I doubt that he succeeded. And all of our allies are basically saying, oh my goodness, how do you manage this guy? Nobody can really figure it out. And that's not who you want as the president of the world's most powerful country. That's not going to be good for the long-term influence and power of the United States.
All right, let's talk about Macron. So, another media circus act, President Trump's handshakes with French President Emmanuel Macron. When Trump and Macron first met months ago, Macron one-upped Trump on his famously firm handshakes. But Dana, you wrote this week after the first day of Macron's visit to the White House that Trump has become the alpha this time. So let's look at an example, l'affaire Dandruff. You guys can correct my accent there if you want.
But we do have a very special relationship. In fact, I'll get that little piece of dandruff for that little piece. We have to make him perfect. He is perfect.
So Macron may have turned things around in his speech to Congress yesterday, and we'll talk about that in a minute. But I'm curious, Dana, why do you think he spent the beginning of his trip rolling over like this?
I should point out, first of all, that there's been some pushback on my interpretation of the dandruff scandal, that I thought it was Trump showing his dominance, but apparently Jane Goodall had written that it's actually a sign of when the older gorilla realizes he's fading and a new alpha is emerging. He tries to make the old alpha gesture to put down the younger gorilla, but it's really a fading gesture. I think that Macron, he looked at the Russians, he looked at the Chinese, and he said, right, the way to get what you want from President Trump is to flatter him, is to be a sycophant. And I think he was, in terms of his body language, and he was. I note a substantial difference between what he said with the president of the White House and what he said to Congress the next day. But he walked away saying, oh, maybe we don't need this Iran nuclear deal after all. So, and I gather he's getting a good bit of blowback at home for that. Maybe the president's going to turn around in a couple of weeks and give Macron exactly what he asked for in terms of trade and the Iran deal. But otherwise, he kind of looks like a fool. And I just wouldn't want to be in his position right about now.
I mean, I had a much more positive impression of Macron. I thought he was actually trying to do a balancing act, and I thought he did a pretty good job of it. Because on the one hand, he's trying to be the Trump wrangler for the European Union. He's the only European leader who's established any kind of decent relationship with Trump. And so I think all the other Europeans want him to go there and try to handle Trump and get him to move in the right direction on the Iran nuclear deal, on the Paris Climate Accord, on steel sanctions, all this other kind of stuff. And we don't know if he's going to be successful in that. But at least Trump and Macron do seem to have this kind of positive buddy-buddy relationship, which I think Macron is trying to take advantage of. But at the same time, that did not prevent him from going to Congress and giving a very tough speech. That was a complete repudiation of everything that Trump stands for. And I got to give him credit for that, because he might have hesitated to do that for fear that it would blow up his relationship with Trump, but he didn't. And it's quite possible that Trump doesn't actually care what's said before Congress.
Or he didn't notice because he was watching Fox.
Right, or that Macron's references like flew over his head. Whatever the case, it was nevertheless, I thought it was a it was a gutsy and principled thing for Macron to do.
And that's not a frivolous observation either. That Trump might pass ignorant of what Macron had said before Congress. I think it's perfectly possible that he would not know.
Who's this Lincoln guy?
I mean, the story, if you read the New Yorker piece on the McMaster situation, and if you read the degree to which Trump is complete, I know it's been written a lot about, but the do not congratulate thing with Putin, there's a little more detail in there, and the degree to which he is severed and separated from his briefing materials and sort of any sort of outside information other than television, it's pretty remarkable. There's just nothing.
So I want to bring in a Facebook comment from David H. Bloodworth, and then I want to talk a little bit more about Macron's speech. So first, David says, WAPO is again wrong on how Trump is perceived by world leaders. He is liked by most and feared by a few. He is not afraid to make and push bold moves others avoid. He is also willing to change his mind and negotiate, which most prefer to do nothing, like the past 8 years.
Well, I will. One part of that I certainly agree with, which is that Trump is willing to change his mind, which he does on a seemingly minute-by-minute, hour-by-hour basis, and where he winds up, nobody knows, including on this issue of the Iran nuclear deal on May 12th. I don't really see much evidence that Trump is liked by any of these world leaders, including the ones that he claims are his great friends, like Xi Jinping or Putin or others. I mean, my sense is that they're playing him, they're taking advantage of him, they understand that he's like an 8-year-old child, and if you flatter him and give him sweets and a little military parade, he'll basically follow along with you and more or less do what you want, at least for the time being. And I think that, nobody really takes him very seriously, but they understand that he's the president of the United States and they need to deal with him and they can manipulate him, and they certainly do that. But this notion that he's liked or has formed real relationships, I just, see very little evidence of that.
Send that dear reader a transcript of the Macron speech.
I will do that, and the dear reader will indeed get a little snippet of the Macron speech right now. So Macron, in his speech, repudiated all manner of Trumpist platform planks, and he laid out his vision for this modern world order, I quote, based on a more effective, accountable, and results-oriented multilateralism. So we'll see some more here.
Iran shall never possess any nuclear weapons, but this policy should never lead us to war in the Middle East. There is an existing framework called the JCPOA. We signed it at the initiative of the United States. We signed it, both the United States and France. That is why we cannot say we should get rid of it like that.
So, Max, how much does the United States and Trump's willingness to participate in pacts like the Iran deal or the Paris Agreement or trade deals matter for the success of this world order that Macron is envisioning?
Well, it matters tremendously if, in fact, you believe in the success of this liberal world order, which Trump clearly does not. But, I mean, this was the world that the wise men of U.S. foreign policy in the 40s and 50s, this was the world that they brought into being, this multilateral, all these multilateral institutions like NATO, like the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, which became the WTO, basically trying to create an international rule of law, trying to create this collective security, this promotion and protection of democratic institutions. I mean, this is truly the underpinning of the Pax Americana and of the peace and relative security that Europe and Asia have enjoyed over the last 70 years. And Trump is putting it all at risk because he is, in his heart, is basically an isolationist and a protectionist. And he's not very consistent in implementing any of his ideas. But it's tragic to me that the president who goes before Congress and speaks on behalf of the American-led liberal world order is the president of France, right, because the president of the United States has repudiated that world order.
Go ahead, Dan.
Well, now, of course, if the president meets with Kim Jong-un in Nambia or wherever they ultimately settle on, and he gets a denuclearized, peaceful, fun-loving North Korea and doesn't give anything away for it, I think a lot of people will say, well, all right, maybe he was onto something here. Now, if he gives away...
Yeah, I think the odds of that happening are slim to
right.
none.
And if he walks away having given North Korea control of California, Alaska, and Hawaii, we'll have another view. All of these things will ultimately be tested. Is being bellicose on trade going to improve the United States' trade deficit. Is he actually going to get a better deal from Iran? We won't have to wait too long to see how a lot of these things are going to play out.
Let me ask Max one thing here. In that post-war era, how strong has been the tradition of deference to treaties and agreements, international agreements, executed by the other party when their opponents come into power, come into the White House? In other words, is this really unprecedented for Trump to campaign against a single treaty and to come in and target it and so on and so forth?
Well, in some ways, I guess you can argue that President Obama set himself up for it because the JCPOA, the Iran nuclear deal, is not actually a ratified treaty. It's an executive agreement, and so that means that the next executive can then tear it up. But nevertheless, there's been a long tradition of respecting what your predecessor has done because previous presidents understand that we can't just zigzag and convey the impression that our words are worthless. And in Trump's case, if he wants a deal with North Korea, what is it going to look like to the North Koreans if he's tearing up the Iran nuclear deal right before trying to conclude a deal with North Korea? So it'd be against his own interest to try to nuke the nuclear deal.
So we're going to move on to something else depressing. Reporters Without Borders published its World Press Freedom Index this week, revealing that the United States has slipped 2 places to number 45 out of 180 countries. Not a great look for the nation of the First Amendment. Margot Ewan, the group's North America executive director, said that we saw the downward trend under the Obama administration and that it has worsened under Trump. Listen to how she says Trump is setting an example for foreign governments.
We've seen Erdogan in Turkey mimic Trump's remarks, as well as the Prime Minister in Cambodia, in the Philippines. Duterte and Trump have both called journalists sons of bitches. So we know that there is a correlation there. And there was also a recent story about the U.S. ambassador in Uganda trying to kind of highlight the concerns for press freedom in that country. And the press minister of Uganda basically said, your president can't even take questions at a press conference, so please don't lecture me on our press freedom here.
So I'm curious, how much of this threat to other countries from Trump's antipathy toward the free press is about messaging and how much is more concrete? Are there things that a president can do to put pressure on other countries to give more freedom to the press that Obama did do that Trump isn't doing?
Well, I mean, for decades, the United States has stood for freedom of expression, freedom of the press, all these other basic freedoms that are represented and protected in our own Constitution. And we've been the great defender, the exemplar of those freedoms, but also their promoter and proselytizer abroad. And Trump has no interest in protecting any of those freedoms abroad because he has very little interest in protecting them at home. I mean, he's assailing the press at home, so he's certainly not going to go out of his way to tell a Sisi or Erdogan or Duterte or whoever not to abuse their own press, because if anything, he gives the impression that he's envious. I mean, he wishes that he could lock up reporters, and failing that, he's just trying to, bust up Amazon's The Oath of Postal Service, but he's doing his best to, I mean, traditionally, we've tried to get other countries to emulate our press freedom, and now Trump is emulating or trying to emulate their lack of press freedom.
And when I think it was Trump when he visited China, and certainly Tillerson when he went on a couple swings, international swings. The tradition is when our people go overseas, they do press conferences and force autocrats into situations where they have to answer to the press. But these fellows behave more like the autocrats would have liked them to. In shutting off the press, make it hard to follow them, not having the sort of availabilities that their predecessors had. So symbolically, I think that's very important. And that's
it's not like the United States was #1 in terms of press freedoms to start with. There's been quite a degradation over time in multiple administrations. And this is a complaint during the Obama years of his lack of accessibility to the press and using the investigations, the Espionage Act, various other things. So he certainly set up a predicate for this sort of thing that's going on now. But it is certainly, the president's been sort of flamboyant about it, laughing when Duterte calls the press spies, going to Poland and talking about Germany and Poland talking about fake news CNN. And so it's no coincidence that fake news is now being used by strongmen all over the world. Right, it is American moral leadership. But it's now being used against us because we make our, the administration will make its claims on the world stage, and now Russia and China are saying fake news, and who can blame them?
And it's not a coincidence that for decades the number of democracies in the world was expanding, and now it's contracting. I mean, it's not all having to do with us, but certainly as the United States has pulled back, and it's not entirely Trump either, because President Obama was also trying to pursue a nation building begins at home type of foreign policy and pulling back from that activist role. But as we pull back, and now it's accelerating because Trump is not just pulling back from promoting and defending democracy, he's actually sending signals the other way, that he's actually much more pro-authoritarian than pro-democratic. That erodes, the prospects for democracy in all these countries where it's really on the knife's edge.
So I'm going to cut you guys off and put you on the spot for something totally different. It's been a big day for news. We have some more. We've been getting reports that Bill Cosby's been found guilty on all counts. So that's all 3 counts of sexual assault. Each is punishable by up to 10 years in prison. Sentencing hasn't happened yet. So I kind of want a lightning round of reactions from you guys. We can just go down the line and then we'll close it out so everybody can get back to reading more about that.
Reaction to Cosby?
Yeah.
I'm going to say that he will not be nominated to run the VA.
I'd say justice sometimes is served late.
I mean, I think it shows that, it doesn't matter how rich or powerful you are, that it is possible that the justice system will work in the United States. I think that's a great tribute to the legal system that Donald Trump is assailing on a daily basis.
Yeah, I think there's been a lot of talk about, oh, where's the due process? We just saw a due process. This is what it looks like. So we're out of time, but we're not out of opinions. So keep up with us at WashingtonPost.com/opinions. And if you haven't felt as perfect as Emmanuel Macron this week, remember, it's only Thursday.